The first light of dawn broke cold and gray over Pinewood Valley, casting long shadows through the forest that bordered the quiet neighborhood. Fog clung to the ground like something alive, moving slowly between the pine trunks and settling in the hollows where the earth dipped low. The air smelled of wet leaves and coming winter, sharp enough to sting the lungs. A small figure moved through the mist, barely visible at first, just a shadow among shadows, walking with purpose down a path most people had forgotten existed. The girl was thin, 12 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that swung like a pendulum with each step. Her backpack hung heavy on narrow shoulders, pulling at the straps. But she didn't slow down. She had made this walk every morning for 3 months now, always before the sun fully rose, always alone. Her name was Claire. She stopped at the edge of a clearing, her breath puffing white in the cold air. For a moment, she stood completely still, listening. The forest listened back. Then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, came a sound that made her chest tighten with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite fear. A whinny, low, familiar, filled with recognition. Claire stepped forward, and the clearing opened before her like a secret world. 4 horses stood in the dim light, their coats damp with morning dew, their eyes watching her approach. The black stallion in the center lifted his head sharply, nostrils flaring, muscles tense beneath scarred skin. His name was Thunder, though Claire rarely spoke it aloud anymore. Speaking names made things real, made them hurt. She lowered the backpack carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. No sudden motions, never sudden motions. Her father had taught her that, back when he was still alive to teach her anything. Back when these horses had belonged somewhere safe, somewhere hidden, somewhere that no longer existed except in Claire's memory, and in the desperate hope she carried with her every morning before dawn. The old mare, Misty, limped forward first. Her right front leg moved stiffly, arthritis making each step a small act of courage. Claire reached into the backpack and pulled out a small cloth pouch, the kind her father used to keep on his workbench in the barn. Inside were crushed willow bark and devil's claw, mixed with honey to make it easier to swallow. She'd learned to prepare it by watching him, by standing quiet in the doorway while he worked, absorbing everything without realizing she was being taught. Now, those lessons were all she had left. She held out her palm, the mixture sitting in a small mound, and Misty's soft muzzle brushed against her skin. The touch was gentle, trusting, and it made Claire's throat tighten with emotion she couldn't afford to feel. Not yet. Not while there was still work to do. Behind Misty, the young colt named Scout watched with wide, uncertain eyes. He was too young to remember the sanctuary clearly, too young to understand why the safe place had disappeared and left them here in the wild, struggling to survive. He stepped forward hesitantly, and Claire noticed the way his breathing sounded rough, labored. The cold was getting to him. Winter was coming, and these horses weren't meant to live like this, exposed and vulnerable, with nothing but her morning visits to keep them alive. She was 12 years old, and she was watching them die slowly. The thought hit her like a physical blow, but she pushed it away, focusing instead on the rhythm of her routine. Hay scattered on the ground, apples distributed carefully, one for each horse. The special grain mixture her father had perfected over years of work, designed specifically for horses recovering from trauma and neglect. Thunder hadn't moved closer yet. He never did, not right away. Trust was something he'd lost long ago, before Claire's father found him, and even now it came and went like the wind. But he watched her, always watched her with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to the broken places inside her. She understood him better than she understood most people. The sun climbed higher, burning away the fog. Claire knew she had maybe 20 more minutes before she needed to head back, before anyone noticed she was gone, before questions started that she couldn't answer without revealing everything. The walk back to Pinewood Valley felt longer than the walk out, like it always did. Claire's backpack hung empty now, bouncing lightly against her spine as she navigated the overgrown trail. Her boots, worn at the toes and muddy at the soles, knew every root and rock along this path. She'd walked it 63 times now. She'd counted. The neighborhood emerged from the trees like something from another world. Clean driveways, trimmed lawns turning brown with approaching winter. Houses with warm lights in the windows. Normal life, the kind Claire had lived once but could barely remember now. Everything felt different after her father died, smaller, hollower. She slipped through the gap in the fence behind her house, careful not to let the gate creak. The kitchen window glowed softly, which meant her mother was already awake, probably making coffee in that slow, mechanical way she'd developed over the past 6 months. Moving through routines because routines kept you upright when everything else tried to pull you down. Claire opened the back door as quietly as possible. "You're up early." Her mother stood by the counter, still in her robe, holding a mug with both hands like she needed its warmth to survive. Her eyes found Claire's muddy boots, the bits of hay stuck to her jacket, the flush in her cheeks from the cold and the walking. "Couldn't sleep," Claire said. It wasn't exactly a lie. Her mother nodded slowly, like this made sense, like sleeplessness was just another symptom of grief they both suffered from. "You shouldn't walk alone in the woods like that. It's not safe. I'm careful." "I know you are." Her mother's voice softened, became something fragile. "You're so much like him. The way you move, the way you think. Sometimes I look at you and I forget he's gone." Claire stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether this was meant as comfort or accusation. Her father had been the kind of person who filled rooms just by entering them, who could gentle the wildest horse with nothing but patience and presence. Claire was just a 12-year-old girl with secrets she couldn't share and responsibilities she couldn't abandon. "I'm going to change," she said quietly, and escaped upstairs before the conversation could go anywhere more dangerous. In her room, Claire pulled off the muddy clothes and stuffed them in the back of her closet, where the growing pile of soiled jackets and jeans lived. She'd have to figure out how to wash them without her mother noticing. Another problem for another day. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out the notebook she kept hidden beneath her mattress. It was worn now, the pages filled with her father's handwriting from before, and her own careful notes from after. Each horse had multiple pages dedicated to their history, their triggers, their progress. Thunder's pages were the most extensive, covered in observations about his reactions to loud noises, sudden movements, raised voices. Claire flipped to Scout's section and wrote, "Day 63, breathing still rough, possibly getting worse. Need to watch for infection. Might need antibiotics, but don't know how to get them." The words blurred slightly as she wrote them. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears come. Crying wouldn't help Scout breathe easier. Crying wouldn't keep Thunder from startling at shadows. Crying wouldn't cure Misty's arthritis, or heal Willow's fear of every crackling branch that sounded too much like fire. Her father would have known what to do. He always knew. But he was gone, and Claire was here, and the horses were out there in the forest, and somehow she had to figure out how to save them all by herself. School passed in a blur of classes Claire barely registered. She sat in the back of Mrs. Patterson's math room, staring at equations that might as well have been written in another language. Numbers had stopped making sense somewhere around the time her father's funeral ended and the real work began. The work of surviving, the work of keeping secrets, the work of carrying weight no one knew existed. "Claire, can you solve number 7? She blinked, focusing on Mrs. Patterson's expectant face. The problem on the board meant nothing. The only numbers that mattered were the ones in her notebook. Days since she'd found the horses. Days until winter really hit. Hours between feeding times. "I don't know," she said quietly. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with that particular brand of pity Claire had learned to recognize. Everyone in Pinewood Valley knew about her father. Everyone thought they understood what she was going through. None of them had any idea. "That's okay, dear. Take your time." At lunch, Claire sat alone at the end of a table near the windows, picking at a sandwich she'd made that morning, using the last of the bread. Her allowance was gone, spent on hay and grain and the supplements Misty needed. She'd been doing odd jobs where she could find them, raking leaves for Mr. Dawson 3 houses down, walking Mrs. Cole's terrier on weekday afternoons. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. "You look tired." Claire looked up to find Rachel standing across from her, tray in hand, face showing genuine concern rather than curiosity. Rachel had been her best friend before, back when Claire's life had room for things like friendship. Now, she wasn't sure what they were. "I'm fine." "You're not?" Rachel sat down without asking permission. "You're up before dawn every day. You look like you haven't eaten in weeks, and you barely talk anymore. Something's wrong." "Everything's wrong," Claire wanted to say. Everything's been wrong since the accident, since the sanctuary closed, since the world decided it was done being kind. I'm just tired, she said instead. Rachel studied her for a long moment, then pulled an apple from her lunch bag and slid it across the table. At least eat this, please. Claire looked at the apple, red and shining under the cafeteria lights. She thought about Scout, about how he'd perked up yesterday when she'd brought extra fruit, about how she'd given him her last 2 apples and told herself she wasn't that hungry anyway. Thanks, she whispered, wrapping the apple in a napkin and putting it in her pocket. She'd bring it tomorrow morning. She'd already eaten her breakfast. That afternoon, Claire walked the Coles dog through the neighborhood. Earning $5, she immediately calculated into feed costs. 2 bales of hay if she could find them at the discount store. Maybe some of the special grain, maybe. As she turned onto Birch Lane, she noticed the woman watching her from the porch of the corner house. Mrs. Henderson, elderly and quiet, known for keeping to herself. The woman's sharp eyes tracked Claire's movement with an intensity that made her stomach clench with sudden fear. Did she know? Had she seen something? Claire looked away quickly, focusing on the dog, on keeping her expression normal and relaxed. Just a girl walking a dog. Nothing unusual, nothing to investigate. But when she glanced back before turning the corner, Mrs. Henderson was still watching, and something in her expression suggested she saw more than Claire wanted her to. The storm rolled in on a Thursday night, bringing with it the kind of cold that promised winter had finally arrived in earnest. Claire lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the house, shaking the windows in their frames. She thought about the horses out there in the forest, exposed to the weather, and sleep became impossible. At midnight, she gave up trying. She pulled on her warmest jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and climbed out her bedroom window onto the porch roof. The drop to the backyard was easy. She'd done it enough times now that her body knew the movements without thinking. The forest was different at night. Darker, yes, but also more alive, filled with sounds that daylight swallowed. Claire's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rain-soaked bark and the white mist of her own breath. She should have been scared. A 12-year-old girl alone in the woods at midnight during a storm should have been terrified. But the only thing that scared Claire was what she might find when she reached the clearing. Thunder saw her first. He stood at the edge of the tree line, coat slick with rain. And for once he didn't retreat. Instead, he took 2 steps toward her. And in his eyes, Claire saw something she recognized. Not trust exactly. Need. The other horses huddled together in the small shelter of an overhanging rock formation. But it wasn't enough. Willow was trembling, terrified by the thunder that rumbled overhead, each crack of sound making her flinch violently. Scout's breathing sounded worse, a wet rattle that made Claire's hands shake as she approached him. She'd brought what she could carry, extra blankets, the last of the medicine, some emergency supplies. But looking at them now, at their suffering, she knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Not without real shelter, not without proper veterinary care, not without help she couldn't ask for, without risking everything. I'm sorry, she whispered to them, to all of them. I'm so sorry. Thunder moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, smell the wet horse scent of him. He lowered his head until his forehead touched her shoulder, the first time he'd ever voluntarily made contact. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle that Claire's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She sank down into the mud and cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd mastered over the past 6 months, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of someone who'd been holding everything in too long. She cried for her father, for the horses, for herself, for the impossible situation that had no good answer. The horses gathered closer, forming a circle around her. Even Thunder stayed near, his presence solid and real in the darkness. They stood there together in the rain, the broken girl and the broken horses, while the storm raged overhead and the world felt very small and very cold. By the time Claire made it home, soaked and shivering, it was almost 3 a.m. She climbed back through her window, changed into dry clothes, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Scout needed real medicine. Misty needed proper shelter. They all needed more than one 12-year-old girl could provide, no matter how hard she tried. Her father's journal sat on her nightstand, worn leather cover, soft from years of handling. Claire reached for it, letting the pages fall open to a passage she had read 100 times. The hardest part isn't teaching the horses to trust again. It's forgiving yourself for all the times you can't save them. She closed her eyes, her father's handwriting burned into her memory, and tried to figure out how to do the impossible. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night. Claire dragged herself out of bed after 90 minutes of sleep, every muscle in her body aching with exhaustion. But the horses needed feeding, and exhaustion didn't excuse absence. It never had. She was halfway to the clearing when she heard footsteps behind her on the trail. Claire spun around, heart hammering, and found Mrs. Henderson standing 10 feet away, dressed in a practical rain jacket and sturdy boots. The elderly woman didn't look surprised or concerned. She looked determined. "How long have you been following me?" Claire's voice came out sharper than she intended. 3 weeks! Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, her eyes studying Claire, with an intensity that made her want to run. "I've watched you leave every morning at 6, watched you come back tired and covered in hay, watched you spend every penny you earn on supplies you carry into these woods." Claire's mind raced through options. Deny everything. Run. Beg her not to tell. But standing there in the cold morning light, exhausted and desperate, and so tired of carrying everything alone, she found she couldn't summon the energy for lies. "Please don't tell anyone," she whispered instead. "Please." Mrs. Henderson tilted her head slightly. "Tell them what?" "About the horses, about what I'm doing. They'll take them away. They'll separate them. Scout won't survive without the others, and Thunder will never trust humans again if they catch him now, and Misty needs her medicine every single day." The words tumbled out faster and faster until they became something like sobs. "Show me," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "What?" "Show me the horses. Let me see what you've been doing all these mornings." Claire stared at her, trying to read the intention behind those sharp eyes. Was this a trap? A way to gather evidence before calling whoever needed to be called? But something in the woman's expression reminded her of her father, that same patience, that same willingness to wait for trust to build on its own terms. Slowly, Claire nodded and turned back toward the clearing. Thunder saw Mrs. Henderson and immediately retreated, head high, nostrils flaring with alarm. Claire stepped between them, hands out in the calming gesture her father had taught her, and made the low clicking sound that meant, "Safe, stay calm, you know me?" Mrs. Henderson stayed perfectly still by the tree line, watching. Claire moved through her routine exactly as she always did, distributing feed, checking each horse carefully, mixing Misty's medicine. She knelt beside Scout, listening to his labored breathing, her hands gentle on his neck. When she pulled out her notebook and made careful notes, she could feel Mrs. Henderson's eyes on her, observing every movement. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, Claire stood and walked back to where the elderly woman waited. "That's not a child playing with wild animals," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "That's a trained horse person doing skilled rehabilitation work." Claire's throat tightened. "My father taught me." "I know who your father was." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "I knew him, actually. Not well, but enough. He helped my sister's horse 15 years ago. A rescue case everyone else said was hopeless. Your father saved that animal's life." Something loosened in Claire's chest. "You knew about the sanctuary?" "I suspected. Your father was never one for publicity, but word gets around in small communities. People who care about animals always find each other." She looked back at the horses. "These are from his sanctuary, aren't they? The ones that escaped during the relocation?" Claire nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "And you've been caring for them alone for 3 months, 12 years old, grieving your father, and you've taken on the work of a professional rehabilitator." Mrs. Henderson's voice held something like wonder. "Child, that's remarkable, but it's also not sustainable. I know." The admission hurt. "But I don't know what else to do." Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, watching Thunder cautiously approach the hay pile now that the immediate threat seemed to have passed. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "You're going to let me help you." They sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, close enough to keep watch over the horses, but far enough away not to spook them. Mrs. Henderson had produced a thermos of hot chocolate from her jacket pocket, and Claire wrapped her cold hands around the cup gratefully. "Tell me about each of them," Mrs. Henderson said. "Everything, their histories, their needs, what your father was working on with them. So Claire told her about Thunder, who'd been beaten so badly by his previous owner that he couldn't stand to be touched for the first 6 months at the sanctuary. About Willow, rescued from a barn fire that killed 3 other horses, who still panicked at the smell of smoke or the crack of burning wood. About Scout, born at the sanctuary to a mare who'd since been successfully rehomed, too young to understand survival but old enough to feel the loss of safety. About Misty, 30 years old with arthritis in 3 legs, who'd been days away from being put down when Claire's father intervened. Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Claire finished, the elderly woman pulled a small notebook from her pocket, worn and practical, like something a person who solves problems might carry. "Scout's breathing concerns me most immediately," she said, writing quickly. "That needs veterinary attention within days, not weeks. Misty's medicine we can manage short-term, but winter shelter is essential for her joints. Thunder and Willow are stable but vulnerable. Thunder especially needs consistency and patience, which you're providing, but that level of care is burning you out." Claire blinked, surprised by how quickly Mrs. Henderson had assessed and prioritized the problems. "You know about horses." "My family bred them when I was younger. Nothing like your father's specialized work, but enough to recognize quality care when I see it." She looked at Claire directly. "You've been doing extraordinary work, but you're also drowning, and you're too proud or too scared to call for help. If anyone finds out, they'll take the horses. They'll split them up, send them to different places. Scout won't make it without the others. And Thunder," Claire's voice cracked, "he'll think my father abandoned him again." Mrs. Henderson's expression gentled. "What if I told you there's another way? A way to get them proper care, keep them together, and protect what your father built?" Hope fluttered in Claire's chest, dangerous and painful. "How?" "Your father's sanctuary was legitimate. He had permits, insurance, the legal structure to operate. When he died, everything went into probate, and the assumption was made that the work should end, the horses relocated. But technically, those permits and that structure still exist. They're just dormant." Claire leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means if someone with the proper credentials, someone who knew your father's work and methods, were to petition to reactivate the sanctuary, the legal framework is already there, especially if that person could demonstrate they had support from the community and from someone who'd been directly trained by your father." "You mean you?" "I mean us." Mrs. Henderson met her eyes steadily. "I have the credentials, I have the resources, but I don't have what you have, which is the actual connection to these horses, the training your father gave you, and the knowledge of his specific methods. Together, we might actually be able to do this." Claire's mind spun with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "I know you're a 12-year-old child who's been secretly carrying the weight of 4 traumatized horses for 3 months. I know you've been starving yourself to feed them, exhausting yourself to care for them, risking everything to protect them. That tells me more about your character than any amount of formal introduction could." She paused, looking out at the horses. Thunder had moved closer to Scout, standing protectively near the young colt. Willow grazed peacefully, her fear temporarily eased. Misty rested on a soft patch of ground, her breathing easier after the medicine. "But mostly," Mrs. Henderson continued, "I'm doing this because your father's work mattered. It saved lives, both animal and human, and watching it die just because he's gone feels like a waste of something precious. If you're brave enough to try saving it, then I'm brave enough to help you." Claire looked down at her hands, roughened from months of work, and felt something shift inside her. For 3 months she'd been alone with this burden. For 3 months she'd believed she had to be. Now, maybe she didn't. "What do we do first?" she asked. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "First, we get Scout to a veterinarian." Dr. Marcus arrived at the clearing 2 hours later, guided by Mrs. Henderson's carefully worded phone call that had mentioned horses in need, but none of the complicated details. He was younger than Claire expected, maybe 30, with kind eyes and mud-stained work pants that suggested he was used to emergencies in inconvenient locations. He stopped short when he saw Thunder, his professional expression shifting to something like recognition. "Is that—" "I treated a black stallion with those exact scar patterns about 2 years ago, at a private sanctuary run by—" "My father," Claire said quietly. Dr. Marcus looked at her, then at Mrs. Henderson, and understanding dawned in his eyes. The horses that went missing during the relocation, everyone assumed they'd been stolen or had died in the woods. They've been surviving, Mrs. Henderson said, with Claire's help. The veterinarian knelt beside Scout, his hands gentle as he examined the young colt. Claire watched, simultaneously hopeful and terrified. Scout stood still under the examination, too tired to fight, his breathing labored and wet. Pneumonia, Dr. Marcus said finally, his voice grave. Early stages, but it'll get worse fast without treatment. He needs antibiotics, rest, proper shelter. He looked up at Claire. How long has he been like this? 5 days, maybe 6. I knew it was bad, but I didn't know how to... She trailed off, the weight of inadequacy crushing down on her. You kept him alive, Dr. Marcus said firmly. That's not nothing. Most horses with pneumonia in the wild would be dead already. Whatever you've been doing, it's been working. He stood, pulling supplies from his veterinary bag. I can start antibiotics now, but he needs to be somewhere warm and dry. These woods are killing him. We're working on that, Mrs. Henderson said, and Claire heard the determination in her voice. The promise of action, not just words. Dr. Marcus administered the first dose of antibiotics, his movements practiced and sure. Scout barely flinched, as if he recognized on some instinctive level that this was help, not harm. Thunder watched from a distance, still wary, but he didn't run. That alone felt like progress. After checking each horse and leaving detailed instructions with Claire, Dr. Marcus packed his supplies. I'm not going to report this, he said. Not yet, but that's conditional on real progress happening. These horses need proper care, and they need it soon. Understood, Mrs. Henderson said. Give us 2 weeks. 1 week, Dr. Marcus countered. Scout doesn't have longer than that. When he left, Claire sank down against a tree trunk, overwhelmed by the sudden cascade of events. In one morning, her entire secret world had been exposed, examined, and given a deadline. Mrs. Henderson sat beside her. This is the hard part of asking for help. You lose control of the timeline. What if we can't do it? What if 1 week isn't enough? Then we do everything we can and hope it's sufficient. The elderly woman's voice was steady, grounding. But first, we need to have a very difficult conversation. Claire looked at her warily. About what? About telling your mother. The words hit like cold water. No, she can't know. She'll try to stop me, or she'll call someone, or she'll find out eventually. Better it comes from you than from someone else. Mrs. Henderson's tone was gentle but unyielding. And more practically, we need her permission to move forward with the sanctuary petition. You're a minor. Your father's estate is partially yours, but your mother is the legal guardian of both you and that inheritance. Claire's stomach churned with dread. Her mother barely functioned most days, lost in her own grief. How could Claire add this burden? How could she explain that, while her mother was drowning, Claire had been secretly rebuilding the very thing that had defined her father's life? She won't understand, Claire whispered. Maybe not at first, Mrs. Henderson agreed, but she loved your father, and she loves you. Give her the chance to show up for both of those loves. That evening, Claire stood outside her own house, her mother visible through the kitchen window, making dinner like she did every night. The routine of it, the normalcy. Claire was about to shatter all of that with truth that couldn't be unsaid. She took a deep breath and went inside. Claire's mother stood at the stove, stirring pasta sauce that filled the kitchen with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. She looked tired, like she always did now, her shoulders carrying invisible weight that never lightened. Mom, Claire said, I need to tell you something. Her mother turned, wooden spoon in hand, and the expression on Claire's face must have warned her, because all the color drained from her cheeks. What's wrong? Are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt, but I've been keeping a secret, a big one, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you react. Her mother set down the spoon carefully, moving to the kitchen table. Sit. Tell me. So Claire told her. Everything. The morning she'd discovered the horses in the woods, drawn by sounds she'd recognized from her father's sanctuary, the 3 months of secret care, the daily routine, the slow drain of her allowance and energy, Scout's illness, Misty's arthritis, Thunder's scars and fear, Mrs. Henderson's discovery and offer to help, the veterinarian's ultimatum. Her mother listened without speaking, her face cycling through shock, fear, anger, and something else Claire couldn't identify. When the story was finished, silence filled the kitchen like fog. "You've been doing this alone," her mother finally said, her voice strange and tight. "For 3 months, you've been carrying all of this alone. I didn't know what else to do. You could have told me." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm your mother. You could have told me." "You were barely holding on," Claire said, her own voice breaking. "You still are. How could I add more weight to that?" Her mother reached across the table, taking Claire's roughened hands in her own. "Look at me. Really look at me." Claire forced herself to meet her mother's eyes. "I've been so lost in my own grief that I didn't see you drowning in yours," her mother said, tears spilling over now. "I thought you were coping better than me. I thought you were resilient, strong, handling it. But you weren't coping. You were surviving. And you were doing it alone because I wasn't present enough to see that you needed help. Mom, your father would be proud of what you've done, the care you've given those horses, the way you've honored his work. But he would also be furious with me for letting you carry it alone." She squeezed Claire's hands. "No more secrets. No more doing this by yourself. We're going to figure this out together." Claire felt something inside her break open. 3 months of held tension releasing all at once. She started crying, really crying, and her mother came around the table to hold her. They sat there on the kitchen floor, Claire sobbing into her mother's shoulder, while the pasta sauce simmered forgotten on the stove. When the tears finally subsided, her mother pulled back, wiping Claire's face with gentle fingers. "Tell me what you need, not what you think I can handle. What you actually need to save those horses. Mrs. Henderson wants to help reactivate Dad's sanctuary, but we need permission to use his permits and property. We need resources and time and help, and we need it fast because Scout is sick and winter is coming, and then we'll do it," her mother said simply. "Just like that?" Her mother's laugh was wet and broken. "Just like that? Your father spent his life saving broken things and giving them second chances. How could I refuse to help continue that work? Especially when it might save my daughter in the process." That night, Claire's mother called Mrs. Henderson. The two women talked for over an hour, voices drifting up the stairs to where Claire lay in bed, finally allowing herself to rest. She heard phrases like legal petition and community support and timeline acceleration. She heard her mother's voice grow stronger, more focused, more like the person she'd been before grief hollowed her out. And for the first time in 6 months, Claire fell asleep feeling something that might have been hope. The next week passed in a blur of activity that felt both frantic and purposeful. Mrs. Henderson moved with the efficiency of someone who'd organized difficult things before, making phone calls, filing paperwork, calling in favors from decades of community connections. Claire's mother emerged from her grief fog with startling intensity, diving into her late husband's files, locating permits and insurance documents, making herself useful in ways that surprised them both. Dr. Marcus visited the clearing twice more, monitoring Scout's progress. The antibiotics were working, but slowly, and the young colt was still dangerously weak. 4 more days, he said on his 3rd visit. That's how long I can ethically wait before I have to report this to Animal Services. 4 days to accomplish what should have taken months. Claire spent those days in the woods, maintaining her routine with the horses while chaos organized itself around her. Thunder had started approaching Mrs. Henderson now, cautiously extending the same fragile trust he'd given Claire. Willow seemed calmer with multiple gentle presences. Even Misty showed improvement, her movements less pained with consistent medicine, and the knowledge that help had finally arrived. On the 4th day, Mrs. Henderson's car arrived at Claire's house, pulling a horse trailer behind it. "The old sanctuary property," she explained. "I've been in contact with the estate lawyer. Your father owned it outright, which means it passed to your mother and you. It's been sitting vacant since the closure, but the structures are sound. We can move them today." Claire's mother emerged from the house in work clothes, her hair pulled back, her face determined. "Let's bring them home." The transfer took hours. Thunder was the hardest, his trust still fragile enough that the trailer terrified him. Claire stood at the entrance, hands out, voice low and steady, repeating the calming phrases her father had used. "You're safe. I promise you're safe. I won't let anyone hurt you." And somehow, impossibly, Thunder walked into the trailer. The sanctuary was exactly as Claire remembered it. The large barn with individual stalls that could be opened or closed depending on each horse's needs. The fenced pastures with shelter from weather. The small office where her father had kept his journals and records. Everything was dusty, unused, waiting to be brought back to life. They unloaded the horses one by one into the main pasture. Scout stumbled slightly but stayed upright, his breathing already easier in the warmer environment. Misty walked to the shelter and lay down on the soft bedding someone had already prepared. Willow explored cautiously, nostrils flaring at scents both familiar and forgotten. Thunder stood at the fence line, looking out at the forest beyond, and Claire's heart clenched with sudden fear. Would he run? Would he choose the uncertain freedom of the wild over the safe captivity of the sanctuary? But then he turned, looked back at Scout, and walked slowly to stand beside the young colt. Choosing connection over isolation, choosing to stay. Mrs. Henderson and Claire's mother worked together to set up the office, organizing supplies and making lists of what still needed to be done. Dr. Marcus arrived with more medication and thorough examination equipment. People from town started appearing, people who'd known Claire's father, who'd heard about the sanctuary's potential reopening, who wanted to help. Claire stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed and grateful and exhausted. Her mother found her there as the sun started setting. "You did this," she said quietly. "You saved them? Your father would be so proud." Claire leaned against her mother's side. "We did this. All of us." "Yes," her mother agreed. "But you started it. You held on when no one else knew to hold on. That's the hardest part." 3 months later, winter had fully settled over Pinewood Valley, covering everything in white silence. But inside the sanctuary barn, warmth and life thrived. Scout's pneumonia had cleared completely, and he'd gained back the weight he'd lost during those desperate weeks in the wild. He followed Claire around the barn now, confident and playful. A different horse entirely from the sick colt she'd once feared wouldn't survive. Misty's arthritis would never fully heal, but with proper shelter, consistent medication, and soft bedding, she moved with less pain and more dignity. She'd become the grandmother of the small herd, watching over the others with patient wisdom. Willow had started accepting touch again, allowing Claire and Mrs. Henderson to groom her gently. She still startled at loud noises, but the panic attacks came less frequently now, and when they did, she had Thunder beside her, solid and steady. Thunder himself was the biggest transformation. He'd never fully trust the way untraumatized horses did, but he'd learned to accept care, to respond to Claire's voice, to stand calmly while she checked his old injuries. Some mornings, he even nickered when he saw her coming, a sound of greeting rather than wariness. The sanctuary was officially reopened, operating under Mrs. Henderson's credentials with Claire as assistant trainer. Her mother managed the administrative side, finding purpose in organizing the very work that had defined her late husband's life. They'd taken in 2 new horses already, both rescue cases, both given up on by others. Claire stood in the barn on a cold Saturday morning, watching the horses eat their breakfast. The smell of hay and horse and warm barn reminded her of her father so strongly it hurt. But it was a good hurt now, the kind that came from holding on to memory rather than being crushed by loss. "He'd be proud, you know." Claire turned to find her mother in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She'd started saying this often, these small reminders that grief and pride could exist in the same space. "I know," Claire said, accepting the mug. "I feel him here sometimes, in the quiet moments. When Thunder finally relaxes or when Scout does something funny. I feel like Dad's watching, approving." Her mother nodded, eyes shining with tears that were becoming less frequent but never fully gone. "He left you such an incredible gift, not just knowledge, but purpose, and you honored that gift by refusing to let it die." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the horses. Outside, snow fell in soft white curtains, covering the world in gentle silence. But here, in this place her father had built and Claire had saved, life continued, broken things healing, trust rebuilding, second chances taking root. Mrs. Henderson arrived mid-morning with groceries and supplies, her car crunching through fresh snow. She'd become a permanent fixture in their lives, equal parts mentor and friend. She found Claire in the office, updating the journals the way her father had taught her. "Your handwriting's getting better," Mrs. Henderson observed, reading over her shoulder. more confident, less like you're afraid the words will disappear. Claire smiled slightly. Maybe because I'm not afraid anymore. Or, at least, not in the same way. Fear is useful, Mrs. Henderson said. It keeps us careful, but it shouldn't keep us paralyzed. You learned that lesson young. That afternoon, Rachel visited, bringing a basket of apples her mother had sent for the horses. Their friendship had found new footing, built now on honesty rather than the secrets that had created distance. "Can I help with feeding?" Rachel asked, and Claire nodded, grateful for the company. They worked together in comfortable rhythm, distributing hay and checking water troughs. Rachel had started learning too, absorbing the same lessons Claire had learned from her father. Knowledge passed down, legacy continuing, the circle unbroken. As the sun set behind the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Claire stood at the fence watching Thunder graze peacefully beside Scout. The black stallion looked up once, meeting her eyes, and something passed between them. Understanding. Trust. The knowledge that they'd both survived impossible things and come through stronger for it. Her father had taught her that broken things could heal, that patience and gentleness could rebuild trust, that the most important work often happened quietly, without recognition or praise, in the small daily acts of showing up and trying again. Claire had learned those lessons in the hardest way possible, but she'd learned them. And now, standing in the place her father built, continuing the work he'd started, she understood that legacy wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. The horses were safe. The sanctuary was alive. Her family was healing. And somewhere, Claire liked to think, her father was smiling. The snow continued falling softly, covering the world in white promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses to save, new lessons to learn. But tonight, there was peace. The hard-earned, fought-for peace of knowing she'd done what seemed impossible. She'd saved them all by refusing to give up. And in the process, she'd saved herself.